Hello, welcome to another Museum FAQ video. My name is Paul Orselli. I'm the chief instigator at POW, Paul Orselli Workshop here on Long Island. And I'm really pleased to be joined today by Jim Spadaccini in the wilds of New Mexico. Thanks for coming on, Jim. I always like to start out by letting people sort of talk about their background for a bit to sort of how you got to where you are now, because I think it's always interesting to hear about people's background and experiences.
Sure. Well, thank you, Paul, and thanks for having me in this video conference. You know, I have a small company, Ideum. We develop museum exhibits. We're probably best known for touch tables, but we do a lot of different things here. And before I started the company and before I moved to New Mexico, I was in California and I was at the Exploratorium where I was the director of interactive media.
Cool. So obviously your bona fides are in place. You've sort of, your museum career has sort of grown with the technologies as it continues to grow. So I think that's always interesting. So I'm sure you, of all people, as a company that is sort of recognized as a leader and a builder, I mean, you make the things there in New Mexico of touch tables. You probably had a lot of thoughts when this pandemic hit. So maybe you could share some of those initial thoughts. But then let's talk a little bit more strategically about where we go moving forward.
All right. No, that sounds good. Yeah. No, we've given this a lot of thought. I mean, I think people don't want to touch. That's primarily what, you know, that's the problem, and it's not just our problem. Hands-on exhibits, children's museums, hands-on science museums, everybody shares the same problem. And I don't think there's a magic bullet for it. I also think that it is going to be a, you know, it's going to be a problem that's going to be with us for a while. When back in 2008, 2009, there was the swine flu, and museums took a little hit and people were afraid to touch, and that lasted a few months. I think even if we got to a vaccine early, this is going to linger for months or even years afterwards. So I think it's you know, it's a bit of a troubling development for those of us who believe that touch is actually, it's not just a way to get information or to, you know, to interact. It's a way to learn. And I think some of the challenges there are, you know, how do we, there's some mechanics involved, including, like, you know, where can people clean their hands? Can they clean these screens or these exhibits? But I also think there might also be some new technologies that might be a bridge as well, that we might look to put those in. And that's one of the nice things about digital. I think it's harder to retrofit your physical hands-on exhibit. But there are some ways that you can retrofit, you know, digital museum exhibits.
Yeah, and I think what you say is a really good point. I know before we started recording, I told you that, you know, someone I was talking with said, well, we just need to have a completely touchless children's museum. And I was like, oh, how do we do that? Because that really is part of human nature, to touch and to learn in a tactile way. But how we balance that with the other part of human nature after months of telling people to social distance and be careful about what they touch and be careful about, you know, being in too close contact with other people, we need to be mindful, I think, about that and not just blow the whole thing up. So I'd be interested, just from your perspective, which I really appreciate, since you are literally in the trenches, you know, designing things and also creating the hardware. You're sort of on the software and hardware side and creative side. So maybe we could talk a little bit about your thoughts about, you know, I'm going to say more sort of rethinking and retrofitting existing technologies, or even, existing experiences from your perspective, but then what you see on the horizon, because obviously you're always looking at new technologies and new approaches. So I'd like to, I don't know if you know that African symbol Sankofa. It's like a bird looking over its back. So you look backward to move forward, or you look backward to learn about new things. So I'd like to do both of those things. Some thoughts you have about rethinking or retrofitting existing museum experiences and museum techniques, but then also looking forward.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, sort of looking backwards, looking forward, because the first thing that came to mind when this situation started to emerge was that I was reminded of a project that we did with Intel years ago, where we built a voice and touchless desktop software system, and you could control. I think the example we used was YouTube, and you can control videos, full screen, stop, volume up, volume down, and you could also use voice. The system worked remarkably well, even with, this was 2015, even with the sort of first wave of sort of touchless, motion detection devices. But it was a solution looking for a problem. And the problem wasn't there yet, but the problem's here now. And the reason it didn't take off, or there wasn't more interest in it, I think, was because you have a mouse, you have touch, you have more efficient ways, more intuitive ways to interact. But now that we're in this sort of new COVID-19 world, we've been thinking about that example, and in fact, I wrote an article about that particular example, and we are looking to try to revive this and to try to retrofit one exhibit, and then look to see whether this could become some kind of a system that we use. And I think the voice thing has always been an issue in museums. They're too noisy, and that probably won't work. The other thing was I was talking with one museum that's a memorial, and the idea of voice to command anything in that sort of setting is also just not appropriate, right? But the touchless gestures, if you can come up with ones that are intuitive enough, that provide enough visual feedback and allow people to access the information to have that experience, then I think you might have something there. And what's interesting to me is that I've talked to a couple of different museums, and actually a couple of corporations as well, that have investments in digital media, and they don't know how they're going to reopen, because the digital media has become such a key component of so many museum experiences. So, what do you do? Okay, great, you open your museum with 25% capacity, okay, but then people don't want to come up and touch the sort of key components within that museum experience. So that's a real problem, and we finally have a problem for that solution.
Well, and obviously not just museums. I mean, you go to an ATM, or you go to a checkout with your credit card and some sort of reader, or other sort of retail experience. I mean, it's ubiquitous.
Well, and I think ideally what we're looking to do is to build some sort of a system that would allow for multiple inputs, so that, and it's sort of similar to some of the accessibility systems that we've built for our hardware as well. We think about that as a model of, you're adding this on to this other part of the experience. So we're not looking to remove touch forever, because there'll be a time when you'll want it back. But maybe you can interact with touchless gestures. Maybe you can with your voice. Maybe you can pick up your phone and get an interface that would allow you to view the content and interact on a touch table or on a kiosk. with your own personal device. So I think if you can build the right kind of, if you can structure that system in an intelligent way, then you can build it so that it has, there's multimodal input. So you can have input of all different types. And again, there's a benefit there. That benefit could be accessibility. The benefit, so there's some benefits that'll go beyond this whole COVID-19 experience that I think will have some lasting effects.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, this sort of brings together the notion of universal design in a really positive way. I mean, we can look at it as this accessibility and universal design opportunity, in addition to, again, being mindful of people's concerns and that. So there are obviously all those opportunities for, sort of recalibrating or rethinking or rejiggering the things that already exist. But I'd be curious, since you are on the bleeding edge, or you sort of know a lot of things, what are things on the horizon that relate to these issues, but that are really you see as exciting possibilities moving forward?
Well, we've for years now we've been developing exhibits that are touchless. They tend to be more full body kind of motion exhibits, and everybody's seen those, and other people have developed them as well. Things that use Kinect, right? And you go up and you flap your wings, you're a bird, or yeah. And I do think what's interesting to me is that technology is now sort of reaching a level of maturity where you can expand it a little bit more. And we're developing a digital dinosaur exhibit which is really fun, for Las Vegas Museum of Natural History. And what we're doing there is we're using multiple Kinects. We're tying this data together. And we are, there's going to be those kind of gross movements where, the raptor kind of tracks you, but we're also doing things like you'll grab a fern and then you can feed the ankylosaurus. Like there's things like that are going to be kind of neat. And I think what's exciting to me is that we're getting skeletal tracking from multiple Kinects, which allow us to do things with a little more fidelity in that kind of a setting, in what would be a social setting. Now, you might have your social distancing, but this is a 16-foot projection, so you could be 6 feet apart, still interact with other people, and you can actually do more than just these sort of gross body movements. That there's actually a few more things that you can do in that environment. And even though this has been a little slow to develop, I do think there's going to be more interest in those types of experiences. And I think that will be more of a driving force to, continually improve not just the technology, but also the design, because the other part of this is giving people appropriate feedback is absolutely essential to these touchless experiences. Or it just becomes this, it becomes Recollections, which is great, but Recollections has been around for 20 years, so the exhibit at the Exploratorium. So so I do think there's to get it to a point where people really feel like I'm interacting in a more direct way, that it's not just we kind of have, in the past, we've relied on nature, and animals sometimes have your attention, sometimes they don't. And that would kind of make up for the times when the technology worked or didn't. But I think part of it is, can we get that technology to a point where there's a lot more reliability in it, and then we can do a lot more.
Well, and I think it's interesting to also look for the opportunities for cooperative social behavior too, and not just gee whiz, and so, are there opportunities as the techniques continue to mature and the technology obviously continues to improve and mature, for those sorts of social opportunities? I mean, it's an interesting paradox. after we just push out of like social
Right.
distancing and avoid that.
Right.
Can we really provide? Can the digital interfaces and these sort of interfaces actually provide in a safe way a really compelling cooperative narrative and social experience? So yeah, that's great.
Well, and that's really what drew us to getting into touch tables to begin with, was that this was an opportunity for people to do things together, and you don't really do that anywhere else in computing, where you're physically in the presence of another person working together doing things. And so that's what's a little frustrating about this experience, because suddenly it's
I
like,
bet. I bet.
but I think, I mean, because we've talked about this too, the hands-on nature of exhibits and that social interaction are absolutely key to the kind of outcomes that museums are looking for. So, how do we provide that in this world of social distancing, and you're not supposed to touch anything? That really undermines our basically the mission of museums all over the world.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's something, obviously, your crystal ball is no clearer than mine or anybody else's, but I think, we were talking about earlier, I think the fact that you have a core team and you've been working to keep that core team together, that's something that will serve you well as you start thinking when museums reopen or phase to reopen, how that's going to happen. Are there any other sort of new and exciting things on the horizon that you can share or feel like might give people some additional food for thought as we look at the reopening of museums?
Well, I'm the only other thing I would say is I'm wondering, as we're involved more and more earlier in the exhibit planning process, and as these new opportunities come in, I'm wondering how the design, the layout, the number of exhibits, the spacing of exhibits, how is that going to change based on this? Is there a sanitation station next to every single hands-on exhibit? Probably, right? I mean, there's those kinds of things that are good, that those might start to make their way into the planning process a little bit earlier. And I don't know if those are going to seem kind of, bizarre, 3 years from now when the museum finally opens, or whether they're going to seem like super relevant, And I think that becomes a whole nother question. And again, I think I would probably rely on your crystal ball in this case, Paul, because I think you've been doing that kind of work maybe longer than we have.
It's interesting. I mean, even something like the density of exhibit components or exhibit furniture pieces, generally in a children's museum, it is a higher density. Things are more packed than an art museum, let's say. But yeah,
right.
Or
small enclosed spaces, or, like those kinds of things in these, like small theaters, or
tactile dome.
Tactile dome, exactly. Yeah. Well, but it's funny that it's not that, the density of exhibits. I remember that being a question in the 90s at the Exploratorium, where it was like, people kept building them and they kept going on the floor. And then there was this, huge museum-wide conversation, I'll use that word instead of argument, about kind of what is the proper density, how many exhibits are too many, and people said, oh no, it's the eclectic nature and the fact that there are so many exhibits and people can't see everything. And then other people said, yeah, but they're not getting a cohesive experience. You come in and you don't feel like you even want to go a third of the way through the museum. So there have always been that sort of tension, I think, and I'm wondering how this new world, how that plays into those kinds of arguments.
Well, it is interesting because, of course, the first visitors, as museums start to reopen, are sort of self-selected. They're the people who are going to feel comfortable coming back to museums. So, you know, we're seeing this sort of slice of our visitors, and you know, in the same way that we don't want to throw everything out. You know, oh, okay, we want a completely touchless museum. We can't immediately, as is often the way of museums, draw a knee-jerk reaction just from this initial wave of people coming in, because they may well not be reflective of our entire audience who will come as time marches along and people begin to feel more comfortable and reopen museums hit their stride. So
Right. Well, and one would wonder too, you know, as museums invest more and more, I think in the idea that we're going to do more things virtually or we're going to do more things on the web, whether there's a reaction to that when this is over, that's sort of the last thing I want to do is get on a video conference. I want to have a conversation. I want to go out and see things in public and have real experiences, not virtual experiences. So it does become this sort of balancing act about, you know, and I don't think anybody knows how this is all going to unfold, and that's what's going to be very, very interesting to see. Just, you know, how museums, you know, the state of museums a year from now or 2 years from now or 3 years from now, because I think without us really knowing when this is going to end, it's incredibly difficult to be able to plan, you know. And I it's, you know, we've worked with museums for so long, and we feel really badly for you know, museums that you know, we know how hard it is to have their doors closed and to be in that situation. It's extremely difficult. It's almost a heart-wrenching thing, because when you work at a museum, you know, you fall in love with the place. I mean, I still love the, you know, the Exploratorium. I will always love the Exploratorium.
And you have to fall.
Not open.
You have to fall in love with your projects too. I mean, you know, and it's like,
yeah, and nobody's interacting with them. Yeah.
Well, you know, these are interesting times. Although, as that old Chinese curse is, "May you live in interesting times." So, you know, I think we're trying to make the best of it now, and maybe if there is a silver lining to what's going on now, it's giving people an opportunity to consider, okay, how are we going to play this out when we do start to phase in the reopening kinds of things. So,
well, the term that I've heard a lot is resilience, and I think, you know, the organizations that are trying to hold this together and figuring out how to adapt, I mean, they are going to be the ones who are going to be, you know, they're going to be resilient, and they're going to be the ones that are going to be rewarded when this is over. And I think a lot of museums will become stronger for this. I think some museums may go away because of this, and I think that's really hard to take. You know, but I think that's just the reality of the situation that we're in.
Well, I'm really pleased we had a chance to talk today and share equal measures of sort of grim reality, but hopeful hopeful futures, which I think is what is the order of the day. So thanks a lot, Jim. I really appreciate you taking the time today.
All right. Thank you, Paul.